I sighed as I saw the toll booth looming up in front of us. My wife and I had driven down this road 1,000 times in the 10 years we'd been married. It was actually the place we took our first date, and we loved to drive down it on Sundays and feel nostalgic. Despite the number of times we've driven the long and winding route, the toll booth always surprises me a little. It sounds weird to say that our first date was a drive, but I think it was honestly pretty sweet. I'm a photographer, have been since I was 19, and I often shoot weddings and family photos for people in the area. I've got an amazing eye for location, and my photos have been featured in not just people's homes, but also in magazines that debut the beauty of North Georgia and the Carolinas. The Appalachians have been my home since I was born, and I know how to bring out her beauty in my photos. I was 22 and on my way to a wedding when I spotted a car on the side of the road with a young woman sitting on the hood. She waved her hands at me, asking if I would stop, and I rolled down my window to see if I could help. She said her car had broken down and was wondering if I could help her out. I'm no mechanic, and my car knowledge stops at changing my oil, so I offered her a ride to the wedding I was attending so she could call a wrecker. She agreed and ended up hanging out with me the whole wedding. The wrecker couldn't get there for 3 or 4 hours, and I was the only person that she knew. So, in between photo shoots, we talked. I got her some food. Weddings usually have a little extra, and this one was more of a country union than a black tie affair. We sat around and chatted as I took some candid shots. We discovered that we actually had a lot in common, and when the wrecker called her, she told him to just drop it off at her mechanic. I drove her home afterwards and invited her to dinner with me later that week. I know what you'll say, it wasn't a real date, but it meant something to us, and we've considered it our first date for years. We even went back on our first anniversary to put a marker where her car had broken down. It may be a little macabre, but we put a wreath there to commemorate her little coupe. It had died on that spot the day we met. We still keep that wreath up. We stop at it sometimes so we can remember how we came to know each other. The spot where her car died is about 2 miles from the toll booth. The toll booth is an oddity. It's just a random toll booth out in the middle of the woods. You put 50 cents in the basket, the booth is never manned, and you head on your way. I have no idea who comes to collect the money. I don't imagine it makes a lot of it, but it's probably some senator's nest egg for when he gets put out of office. We always keep change in the car for just such an occasion, not minding paying a little toll to see the road that started our happy life. Today, however, I couldn't find 50 cents in the cup holder. It's been a busy week. We just put a down payment on our new house, my wife just started a new job, and I had just finished shooting a big wedding that more than paid for the down payment on the new house. But it left us a little light otherwise. We had cashed in our change jar that sat in the cup holder, something to get us by till payday, and I had forgotten to put more change in it afterwards for the toll road. The drive was kind of our date night this weekend. We had a picnic in the back seat, and we were going to go up to the lake where the wedding had been held. The lake was where we had our own wedding, and we went there often to picnic or swim or just enjoy a quiet afternoon together. "What's the matter?" Carol asked. I dug a nickel out from between the seats and weighed the pathetic little pile of change. 5 pennies, 2 dimes, and a nickel were all I had managed to find under the seats. The arm hung stoically across the road, little more than a wooden suggestion than a real barrier. I had thought many times that I could probably just drive through it and be done with the stupid thing, but such things were a little too rebellious for me. "You got any change?" I asked, doubting she did, but wanting to be sure. "No," she said, looking through her purse before exclaiming, "Aha!" and dropping another nickel onto my palm. "Well, it's a little better, but it's not quite 50 cents. Just dig some out of the change cup," she said. I shook the cup at her, reminding that we had recently traded it in. "Oh yeah. Well, what shall we do, my dear?" I considered turning around, maybe just forgetting the whole thing, but a new idea suddenly bubbled to the surface. I pulled onto the soft shoulder of the road, the car protesting as much as my wife. I'm sure my car's wheels were going to bog down any minute. The shoulder of the road is soft turf and seed grass, and I expected my tires would spew up earth and stick. I'd have to sheepishly explain to some highway patrolman how I'd gotten stuck then. To my surprise, though, I drove easily around the barrier. I laughed and wondered why I hadn't simply done this before. "What are you doing?" my wife asked, half laughing but also half aghast. "We've given this thing 50 cents loads of times. I think it can give us a pass, just this once." We both laughed as we drove away from the lonely little toll booth, but I think even then, I felt a slight twinge on the back of my neck. I would remember it later and realize I had been warned. We drove down the familiar road, taking in nature's bounty and chuckling at our daring. The trees were ablaze with early fall oranges and deep, healthy greens. The sky was a perfect robin's egg blue, and I just knew that the lake would be wonderful today. We could watch the sunset, maybe have a little fire before going home, and snuggling in bed at the end of a perfect day. It was a good plan, but someone had a different one, it seemed. As we drove, my wife watched the leaves with interest. My wife is an unofficial leaf looker, though she would never admit it, and our house has many pictures of beautiful foliage. As I drove, the roads winding onward, I saw her lift her head from the car window and squint at the passing colors. We were both getting on in years, no spring chickens now, but the look she was giving the leaves was decidedly prudish. It was like an old maid who simply can't believe Miss Tyler let her daughter out in that skirt. "John, does something seem off about the trees?" she asked, sounding perplexed. I looked at the trees, the oranges and reds and greens looking completely natural to me, and I told her so. It does, but it doesn't. It's like seeing trees on television. They look kind of glossy, recorded even. I don't know how to describe it. They just look a little weird. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was seeing things. It had been a long week, and we had been through some pretty stressful times. It was enough to make anyone a little jangled. She kept watching the trees, but I'd put my eyes back on the road, wanting to be there already. We had driven for about another 30 minutes, though, when I had to slow down. Sitting in the road, white and brown with a glossy oak arm, was the toll booth. I stopped and looked around, thinking somebody might be playing a little joke, but there was no one around. The toll booth looked exactly as it had before. It was simulated wood grain, and the walls were painted a dark brown and creamy white. The arm was simulated oak with a glossy finish. It looked exactly like the toll booth, but it couldn't be. Could it? Maybe they thought they'd put up another one, my wife asked, smiling but clearly confused. I laughed a little at that. They were getting a little greedy out here, weren't they? I pulled around this one too, and I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror as we made our way down the road. My wife was still looking raptly at the trees as we drove past, her attention becoming unhealthy. When she asked me to take a look, I glanced over to see the unusual reds and oranges and greens, but something did look a little off about them. Had they become even more vibrant? The foliage looked artificial, almost neon, and it battered against my eyes as we watched them go past. Okay, there's no way you can tell me that was just my imagination. I didn't answer her. I just wanted to get to the lake so we could have our picnic and all would be normal again. This was weird, yeah, but it was just a strange phenomenon. We would make it to the lake and everything would be okay. When we drove here next weekend, or the weekend after that, everything would be just as it had always been. I edged my speed up a little, wanting to pass the weird Technicolor trees and get into the deep woods I knew were coming. We had driven for about another half hour when my brakes screeched against the pavement. I blinked. It just couldn't be. I had been driving these roads for 10 years, and it was always just the one toll booth. My wife seemed startled too, leaning forward to look unbelievingly at the little booth. It looked exactly like the other two, but that was impossible. We had passed it twice, and I was sure there was only one toll booth out here. There would be no reason to think a second one would make any difference. There was so little traffic out here. "What the hell?" my wife asked. And when I pulled around the arm this time, it was a little more aggressively than I meant to. Maybe, she started, pausing a little as she looked nervously at me, maybe we should just pay the toll. I didn't say anything. I had been too mad to even acknowledge the prickle on the back of my neck this time. Stupid, money-grubbing jerks. They hadn't figured they could line their pockets enough with just one toll booth, so they had to have two more. This was unbelievable. I had a sense of humor about the first one, but if they thought they were going to gouge me for another toll, babe, they had another thing coming. I was going to write my congressman, my senator. I'd write the freaking president about this. They couldn't just, John, gouge people like this. What about tourism? What about local beauty spots? What the hell happened to bringing people out so they could, John! I stopped on the brakes and turned to yell, "What?" at my wife as she stared out the window. Normally, she would have chastised me for yelling at her. I don't think I had yelled at her more than a couple of times our whole marriage, but she was too shaken to even take notice. She was looking out the window, staring at the trees with the strange leaves and pointing with a shaky finger. Look, she stuttered, and I turned to see what she was babbling about. The leaves were still eye-destroyingly bright, but this time they were also melting off the trees. Not regular melting either, but like wet paint dripping off an oversaturated object. I could see them dribbling onto the ground, pooling on the grass as the verdant green lawns became spin art. I put my eyes forward, racing the engine, and tried to reach what I knew was ahead as fast as I possibly could. The toll booth came into view again, but I didn't stop this time. What are you doing?" my wife said, getting nervous as I didn't slow down. I gunned the engine, revving to 70 on the straightaway. "Stop it! Stop! Don't do that!" The engine growled as I nudged it up to 80. "John!" my wife screamed, but it was too late. I crashed through the wooden arm and laughed maniacally as the wooden pieces cascaded off the hood and flew to either side. I had made a lot of mistakes that day, but damaging the booth, that was the worst one. My wife screeched when I hit the arm, but one look at me had reduced her to silence. I glanced over at her and immediately felt sorry for what I had done. My foot came off the ignition and the car slowly spun to a stop in the middle of the two-lane road. I had damaged state property. I was sure there was some sort of camera on the booth somewhere, and it would be easy enough to see me ramming the arm. I thought about driving back to the booth and seeing if there was a number I could call to report the accident, but finally I just decided to keep going so we could make it to the lake before dark. As I drove, I realized my wife had been silent the whole time. I turned to tell her I was sorry, to apologize for going a little nuts back there, but she wasn't paying any attention to me at all. She was looking at the countryside as it rolled by. "Honey, I'm sorry about all that. I just let it all get to me. I'm sorry for yelling. Sorry for acting like a psycho. I was just so... The trees are wrong, John." Her voice sounded on the edge of hysteria. "What?" I asked, craning my neck around. "They're all dead. They're all dead, John." I turned right, wanting to see what she was talking about, but when I saw the trees, I wasn't sure why it had taken me so long to see. The trees, so vibrant and colorful before, were now sickly and forlorn. The vibrant colors had oozed right out of them, and the leaves hung limply from the trees as their bark hung pale and peeling. It wasn't just the trees either. The sky looked yellow and sick. It made no sense. What the hell was going on? This was nothing like how the road usually was. It was nothing like how it had looked the first time we'd seen the toll booth. I put my foot down on the ignition and we kept rolling forward towards our destination. It only got weirder the longer we drove. The longer we drove, the more I expected to run into that toll booth again. The longer I drove and didn't encounter that ramshackled booth, the more paranoid I became. The world outside didn't help much either. The sky became darker and darker as we went. The leaves began to drop from the trees in droves. The limbs were skeletal, the bark crumbling from the long, fragile limbs, and the farther we traveled, the more desiccated they became. We should have come to the deep woods by now. We should have come to the lake by now. We should have seen another car, seen a deer, seen something. My wife stopped looking out the window, and I kept sneaking glances at her to make sure she was okay. She just sat hunkered against the seat, rubbing her shoulders as she tried not to notice what was going on outside. I should have been worried about her. I should have stopped to make sure she was okay, but I was feeling on the verge of mental collapse myself. We never made it to our destination, little as I would have wanted to get out if we had. As the sun began to set, I realized how much worse it could get. "Honey," I whispered, not sure how long it had been since we'd spoken. It felt like days, weeks, but my mind railed against this idea. We were just a little lost on a road we had driven so many times we could have set the mile markers. I wasn't sure what was going on here, but I was sure that we would come out of it okay. "We shouldn't have driven around it." "What?" I asked, confused by her answer. "We shouldn't have hurt the toll booth." She turned towards me and she looked afraid. "We should have just paid the toll. Now it's mad, and it might never let us get off this road." "It's nonsense," I said, but it lacked conviction. I had been out here at night before, driving home after a day on the lake, but I had never seen it this dark. The trees no longer looked to be the old pines that I'd come to love. The trees I could see from the headlights looked more like maples, with a thick dark sap running out of them. If I looked too long at them, some of them even seemed to have faces. I always looked away when I noticed this, afraid to meet their gaze, but I could feel them looking at me nonetheless, challenging me to meet their eyes. As much as I wanted to tell her she was wrong, I couldn't argue the fact that we seemed to be stuck, and it had all started after we drove around the toll booth. "Quick, dig under the seat and see if you can find 15 cents. She looked at me in disbelief. "What? 15 cents? That way, if we see the toll booth again, we can pay the toll and get out of here," I nearly growled at her. She moved slowly, like someone in a dream. She began to search under the seats for change, and as she searched, I kept driving. I was beginning to believe that something outside the norm might be at play here, and the further we drove, the more I also believed that we were being followed. The moon hung overhead, the bright yellow moon like a kid's Halloween drawing, and by that popcorn yellow beam, I could see things running through the woods. They loped along like big dogs, their bodies oddly elongated, and their legs thick and long. I never got more than a quick look at them, but that look was enough. I think I see a quarter in the track of the seat, but I can't get it. Can you pull over so I can reach it? I gritted my teeth, but a quarter would get us there for sure. I pulled over slowly, my lights still glaring into the woods, and told her to please be quick. My wife stepped out, getting down beside the car so she could reach below the seat. I glanced around nervously, watching the woods for signs of the creatures. My wife was saying how she almost had it, but it kept slipping through her fingers. I told her to be quick, and when I looked back at the tree line, I saw one. It was like a mountain lion that had been dipped in tar. It was like a massive cat with black ridges of overlapping plates. I imagined I could see the headlights reflected off its grinning mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, and its claws clicked impatiently on the edge of the pavement. "Carol," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creatures. "I've almost got it," she growled through gritted teeth. The creature didn't seem to have eyes, but its head turned menacingly towards the car as Carol spoke. As the quarter came free, I reached down and grabbed her by the collar of her t-shirt, lifting her into the car. My wife isn't large, maybe 5 feet, but at that moment it wouldn't have mattered if she'd been a giant. I pulled her back into the car and pushed my foot down on the accelerator as hard as I could, the door bumping shut as we got back on the road. If I had hesitated even a moment longer, we'd likely be dead. As it was, I clipped the beastie in the side of the head instead of full in the side. The chest of the creature would have caved the front of my car in, but its head whipped heavily to the side as it broke one of the headlights. I barely noticed as I flew down the road at 70, the other creatures in hot pursuit. We were doing 90 as we barreled forward, but I could see the pack of nightmare hounds right behind us. The rear lights lit their chitinous faces hellishly, and I took the hairpin turns with wheel-screeching accuracy. I'm no NASCAR driver, but the sight of those creatures behind me was enough to push me onward. If they caught me, we'd both be dead. If I crashed, we'd both be dead anyway. Seemed like either way, our options were pretty limited. They followed us for a long while, too long for creatures their size. I was driving 90 most of the time, but they kept pace as easy as if I'd been going 20. I was keeping ahead of them, but only just. I felt them bump the back bumper more than once. They seemed intent on forcing me off the road, but they couldn't quite hit hard enough to force me off. My wife shuddered every time we got hit, and I found myself barely able to keep it on the road after every successful strike. After some indiscriminate amount of time, I looked in the rearview mirror to find that we were alone again. A few minutes later, I saw the toll booth come up into view, but not the one I was used to seeing. This toll booth was black, the paneling looking like the skin on those creatures, and the arm looked like an unprocessed tree trunk. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the money into the basket, whispering sorry as the arm slid up to permit us. We pulled through the turnstile, and it was like crossing some kind of barrier into another world. My grandmother had grown up in Ireland and had sometimes told me stories about people who crossed the barrier between their world and into the realm of Fae. Grandma always said that people could cross into the fairy realm without realizing it, but I knew all too well when I crossed the border out of whatever place we had been in. It was like passing under the coldest waterfall I could imagine. We got home without incident, but it's the craziest thing. We had voicemails from our friends, a client, and even my wife's new job, asking where we were and why we'd been gone for so long. It seemed that even though we had left just after lunch on Sunday, we didn't return till Tuesday night. The car's still damaged, so I know we didn't imagine it. The car is damn near out of gas, and the oil shows that it's almost due for an oil change, despite having been done less than a month ago. I don't know what the hell happened to us, but I know I'll be keeping money in the cup holder from now on. Whether we ever choose to go down that road again or not, I will always have money to feed the toll booths that may appear in my life. You never know where they might take you if you don't play by the rules. There's a legend in my town that has always stuck with me, and it's something we grow up hearing since we're very small. Tommy Cold Toes is as much a part of our lives as things like Soap Sally and the Wampus Cat. It's a story that our parents used to scare us into behaving. It's always the same thing, said in those tones of knowledge that make you believe it's true. Better get to bed on time, or Tommy Cold Toes might decide to crawl into your bed. You better not get up to mischief, or Tommy Cold Toes will find his way into your bed. Don't you dare lie to your mother, or Tommy Cold Toes will let her know. The story it comes from is even more chilling than the thought of a ghost in your bed. It's a story about how even a town with less than 1,000 people can host a murderer. Our town was founded in 1789 by a handful of settlers. By 1819, they had either befriended or conquered the Indians that lived in the area, and their daily struggles were mostly personal. The town had around 300 residents, give or take, and one winter they had a problem with a lake in the area. Mather's Lake was a common place to find picnickers or fishermen, but this winter it became the dumping ground for a serial killer. The accounts say that the sheriff was called to the lake one morning at first light to assess a body. A fisherman by the name of Jeremy Gooding had come before dawn to cut a hole for some ice fishing. As the sun rose, however, he felt like someone was watching him. When he looked down to find a body looking up at him through the ice, he said he nearly had a heart attack. The man had gone in his wagon and driven back to town to get the sheriff, and the sheriff had brought a few men with him with saws to break through the ice. With the help of the fishermen, they had pulled out the body of Gilbert Campbell. Gilbert was a farmer from the area and a notorious sot. He wasn't a very good farmer, and it was well known that he had too many mouths to feed and not enough money to afford his drinking and his children. The general consensus was that he'd been walking across the ice on his way home from town and had fallen through and drowned. He couldn't swim, this was widely known, and he was likely too drunk to properly flounder to the surface. His wife and children mourned him, but it was all chalked up to an accident, and life went on. When Gooding went to the same lake 2 weeks later and found 2 more bodies floating beneath the crust of ice, it was harder to push it off as an accident. The victims, Delbert Moore and Winston Fergan, were from the town, though Delbert was a day laborer and Winston was a blacksmith's apprentice. While Gilbert's route home would have taken him across the lake, there was no reason why either of these men should have been in the area. Delbert worked for a farm on the other side of town, and Winston lived above the blacksmith. The sheriff refused to entertain the idea that these could be anything but accidents, but when the 4th body came out of the lake, he had to admit that they might have a problem. The 4th was Harvey McMillan, the son of Drake McMillan, who owned the local bank, and Drake was mad to catch the man who had killed his son. As Mr. McMillan leaned on the sheriff to get results, the sheriff began to apply more pressure to people of interest. There were patrols set up around the lake, and the other local fishing holes were checked for signs of bodies. That was when they discovered 4 more bodies, all farmhands or laborers, and a pattern began to become apparent. All of them were immigrants, except for Harvey. Harvey was born in town, but he'd taken his accent from his father, and the sheriff supposed that's why he had been targeted. It appeared they had a problem on their hands, and it was a problem that the sheriff was very interested in solving. The local sheriff was supposed to keep the peace, and if he couldn't protect the people from whoever was dropping them into the frozen lakes, then they would find someone who could. The town had instituted a watch, keeping citizens on the street to a minimum after dark. They had to assume that these deaths were the result of people being coerced away after dark, and if they could limit the killer's potential victims, then they could catch him in the act. They suspected Jeremy Gooding for a time, but the boy's alibi was strong. There was a rumor going around that a strange woman might be responsible, luring men away from the tavern so she could hide her crimes beneath the ice. They picked up a few women who frequented the local watering holes, but they were released in short order. For a time, the town lived in fear of who would be the next body pulled out of the icy lake. Then, just as December began, they found the body of Thomas Graves. Thomas, Tommy to his friends, was new in town, but well known by those who frequented the tavern. He was a laborer, but his exploits were known to lie at the bottom of a tankard. Tommy could drink any man in town under the table, and his thirst was as prodigious as he was. What's more, he wasn't prone to anger or the hooligan behaviors of his peers. He was a sociable drunk, a cheery sot, and everyone knew that he could drink a keg and still be awake to do the milking at first light. So when the sheriff was called to Carter's Pond at dusk to collect him, it was considered a shame by all. He had sent a pair of constables out to collect him in a wagon, and as they pulled him from the lake, they say his skin was as blue as the ice atop it. They checked his pulse and found him stone cold dead, so they loaded him into a wagon and took him into town. This was December, so the snow was deep and the road was pitted. They had a sheet over him as he lay in his funeral wagon, and the men shivered as they rode with only the moon to keep them company. Both were in some hurry to be done with this task, so they could get to the tavern themselves before heading home to their wives. The grim task would be easier to sleep on after a drink was inside them, and neither were paying as much attention to the body in the back as they should have. The body bounced like a stone as they rode, and neither of them could have said when that bouncing stopped. When they arrived in the town and pulled the sheet away, they found the back of the wagon empty. They had lost the body somewhere along the way, and when they told the sheriff, he was livid. He told them the town already believed that they were making a botch of this, and made them go back the way they had come to look for it. It should be easy to find, he told them. It's a frozen body lying by the side of the road. The two men set out to backtrack their route, but no matter how much they looked, or how far they went, they couldn't find the frozen body. They found no sign either. There was no indent in the snow, no sign of scavengers taking something away, and they were left to wonder where it had gone. They searched till morning, spending a night in the cold as they looked for their missing victim. They were still searching when the sun came up, and when they heard hoofbeats approaching, they were hoping it was others who would help them look. Instead, the sheriff came riding up with another man in tow to collect them. The body had been found, and it was in the last place they would have expected. Judge Henry Margus, a judge for the county seat, had awoken to find the body of Thomas Graves in his bed. His servants had heard him screaming and come to check on him, finding him in the corner as he shook and pointed at the bed that he had evacuated. They said that he had been gibbering about rolling over, and feeling the cold feet of the dead man against his leg, and wouldn't say much else. He had been shaking as his butler took him off to the sitting room. That same butler, the man who had come out with the sheriff, had secured the bedroom so that they might have a look and come to fetch him immediately. He and his men took statements from the staff and the very shaken judge, but it was ultimately nothing but a strange bit of gossip for the women around the well that day. They took the body to the station so the family could come collect it, and that was when it disappeared a second time. The sheriff, who had reprimanded the two deputies soundly for losing the body in the first place, was perplexed how Thomas Graves had disappeared a second time. He was less perplexed when the judge's footman arrived in the morning to say that Thomas Graves had appeared in his master's bed again. The sheriff arrived to find the man shaken, unable to even speak, but he stuttered about the cold toes of the dead man that had pressed against him as he slept. They took the body away and decided it might be time to bury Tommy Graves so he would stop haunting the judge's house. He would have no idea how fitting a statement that would turn out to be. They buried Thomas Graves in a pauper's grave in the churchyard and thought that they had seen the end of him. They had considered leaving him in the crypt in case his family decided to come for him, but the sheriff was becoming tired of whoever was using Thomas to bedevil the judge. The man hadn't been to court in days, and it was said that the incident had rattled him. The sheriff watched as the undertaker and his apprentice buried Thomas Graves 8 feet in the ground, and hoped that this would be the end of the trouble. It hadn't gone unnoticed that there hadn't been another body found since they had pulled him from the ice, and some of the townspeople were whispering that Graves might have been the killer. Now his body was haunting the judge after death, and somehow that seemed to make it more believable that he was the one putting people in the ice. They had begged the sheriff to put a cage over top his grave, maybe even burn the body, but the sheriff was steadfast in his conviction that Tommy be buried. No servant came on the third day. On the third cold morning after Thomas had come out of the ice, the judge came bursting into the station to confess to murder. He confessed to the murders of all those pulled from the ice, including Tommy Graves. The sheriff's hunch had been right, it seemed, and he confessed to killing all of them because they were immigrants. He had never liked foreigners and assumed that no one would notice if a few of them went missing. He had assumed that someone would catch him after killing Harvey McMillan, but when he had walked away scot-free, he felt invincible. That was before, though. Now he was being hounded by the vengeful Thomas Graves and wanted the sheriff to protect him. I would have never killed him if I had known he would haunt me so. The sheriff knew they would find Tommy in the man's bed again, and that's just where he was when they went to collect him. It seemed, however, that Tommy wasn't content to stay put. They never found him in the judge's house again, but there were plenty of people who claimed to have seen him after that. Usually it was a shadowy figure walking along the road to town, the same route the wagon had taken when he had disappeared. Others say they've seen him near the lake, where he died, walking along the shore and watching the water. Others, however, claim that those with secrets, those with guilt, feel the press of cold toes against their leg in the night and know it's time to confess. I've never felt them, but I know people who claim they have, and that's as good as a confession around here. Whatever the reason, Tommy Cold Toes has become a story told from Halloween till Christmas in these parts. So if you roll over in the middle of the night and feel the cold press of toes against your leg, don't worry. It's just Tommy Cold Toes trying to get warm. Daddy, I lost a tooth. He lisped a bit as he said it, and as I held my hand out, I saw that he had, indeed, lost a tooth. It was one of the front ones, and I congratulated him on losing it so cleanly. I wondered if he had pulled it out himself, but I put that out of my mind. Brandon didn't even pull his own splinters out, and I really couldn't see him yanking out his own teeth. He was 6 in 1 month, as he liked to say, and this was the first tooth that he had lost. He was late in that respect. Many of his friends had already started losing baby teeth, but he was giddy as he brought this one to me. "Now, the tooth fairy will come and take it away," he said, skipping off to continue playing. Ah, yes, I'd forgotten about that part. Brandon had become obsessed with the tooth fairy after his friend Nina had lost her tooth. He thought of her like the blue fairy from the Pinocchio story, and he was very excited that she would come through his window and leave money for his teeth. He had asked what she did with all those teeth, where she got all the money, and 1,000 other things. I was a pretty creative person, and I'd come up with all kinds of stories about what she did with them, where she got the money, and how she came in without making a sound. On and on and on. I was kind of glad that he had finally lost a tooth, because I was starting to run out of material and thought if he experienced it, he might lose interest in it. We put it under his pillow that night, and I assured him that it would be gone in the morning and there would be money when he got up. Then, of course, I fell asleep waiting for my wife to get home and woke up to find her sleeping beside me and the sun already peeking over the horizon. I went quickly but quietly and thanked my lucky stars that Brandon was a sound sleeper. He hadn't woken up yet, and I took the $1 I was going to put under his pillow out of my pocket and prepared to make the swap. To my surprise, however, the tooth was already gone. No one had left money, but the tooth had disappeared. I looked around, thinking it had slipped out, but it was just gone. I left the $1 anyway, not wanting him to be disappointed, and went back to my room to get more shut-eye before the alarm went off. We never made it to the alarm because Brandon came in waving the $1 and saying that the tooth fairy had come. "Look what the tooth fairy left me. He said it was all for me." I told him that was awesome, but internally I raised an eyebrow. He? The tooth fairy had always been a woman anytime he'd talked about her before. Maybe, I thought, Brandon had just had a dream or something that night. He put the money in his piggy bank, and I figured we could maybe put the thing behind us. 2 days later, as I put him to bed, I put my hand beneath his pillow and felt something strange. I took my hand out and found another tooth. "What's this?" I asked. "Oh, I lost another tooth," Brandon said. No excitement, no hope that the tooth fairy would come, just a matter-of-fact tone. I guess that was what I wanted. His obsession with the tooth fairy had ended when he finally lost a tooth. He'd gone from being absolutely excited to absolutely unfazed, and that stopped me for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me you had another loose tooth, buddy?" I don't know. It just kind of happened. I put the tooth back under his pillow, telling him to make sure to say something next time, and then I kissed him goodnight and put him to bed. When I went to put the money under his pillow a little later, though, the tooth wasn't there. Instead, there was a coin. I took a look at it, thinking it was a $50, but realized I was wrong almost at once. At first, I thought it was one of those weird chocolate coins you sometimes got for Christmas. Turning it, I realized it was just extremely grubby. It was heavy, like it was made out of brass or copper, and the surface looked dirty, like it had been at the bottom of a well for quite some time. I started to take it with me, something in me wanting to keep it away from my son, but I put it back instead. It wasn't mine, after all, and by the look of it, it was probably something that he treasured. It had been back under his pillow for less than a second before his hand went searching for it. His fingers took hold of it almost greedily as he clutched it, and I decided to take the $1 back with me. Brandon changed a bit after that night, but it's only in retrospect that I see it. He became very secretive, not my little buddy like he used to be. Brandon didn't want to play video games in the living room with me anymore. He didn't want to read stories at bedtime either. He spent a lot of time in his room, and seemed to be closing off. His mother laughed at me when I told her that my feelings were a little bit hurt by it. He's just being a kid. Kids go through phases sometimes. Don't take it so personally. A couple of months from now, he'll probably be back to his usual self again. I hoped he would, but it was hard to ignore the physical changes that were going on in him as well. Not only was Brandon quieter, but it seemed like he had grown. He hadn't gained a foot in a single week, but sometimes it seemed like his fingers were abnormally long, his arms strangely jointed, and his face was oddly stretched. He would look at me sometimes, look at me like he was thinking about doing something that he knew would make me angry. I didn't like it, but he never did it right out in the open. Like I said, Brandon never came to sit with me or play video games, but I would sometimes catch him peeking at me from the hallway or from under the table in the kitchen. It was creepy, but I figured it was just little kid behavior. A month after Brandon lost his first tooth, I found another one in his backpack. Well, no, not just one. I found 5 hidden in the front pocket of his backpack after he left it on the kitchen table when he went to go to the bathroom. He had become pretty protective of that backpack, putting it in his room or keeping it close by at all times, and I started getting suspicious of what might be in there. I didn't think it was drugs or anything. He was 6, but I thought it might be something weird or dangerous. What if he had a snake or something in there? So when he suddenly ran off to go to the bathroom, I knew this was my chance to have a look. I needed to sign his folder for school anyway, so I took out the folder and looked over the day's report before taking a peek in the pockets. The teeth were just sitting there, bumping together when I poked at them, but they didn't really look like human teeth. They looked more like animal teeth, and they were too strange to have come out of my son's mouth. They might have been from a cat or a dog, I suppose. Maybe a, "What are you doing?" I zipped the backpack and turned around, looking like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't. "Nothing, just signing your folder." Brandon looked at me with a great deal of mistrust, taking the backpack and going to his room without putting his back to me. I told his mother about the teeth when she came back from work, but she brushed it off again, saying that little kids often collected strange things. "My brothers collected animal skeletons they found in the woods," she said dismissively, as we got ready for bed. "Thank goodness it's just teeth and not a whole skull." I let it go, but it was hard not to see what was going on. Brandon started looking like he wasn't sleeping well. He had huge bags under his eyes, and he was fidgety anytime he was made to sit still, like at dinner or for homework. He would get short and agitated, muttering to himself in a way I couldn't understand. I listened carefully once when he was doing math homework, and it sounded like he was talking in a different language. He looked up when he saw me noticing, squinting at me with that look of distrust, and it broke my heart to see him like that. Brandon had always been my little buddy, and this sudden change in him was painful to watch. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the school. They needed to speak with me about something important. Brandon, it seemed, had been in a fight where he had knocked more than a few of the kids' teeth out. I came down right away, afraid that Brandon had been hurt, but when I saw him sitting in the principal's office, he looked none the worse for wear. He had a bruise on his cheek, and his hands looked like he had beat them against a wall, but he didn't seem injured or in distress at all. Quite the contrary, Brandon looked happier than I had ever seen him. I took a seat next to him in the office, waiting to see what they thought was so important. "We called you in, not because Brandon has been fighting, but because of other rumors going around his class." "Rumors?" I asked. "Yes, sir. The student he fought with said Brandon had been making strange deals with other students." I shook my head, not quite understanding. "What kinds of deals?" "They say he's been buying people's teeth." I shuddered, thinking about the teeth in the bag I'd saw not too long ago. I looked down at Brandon, questioning him with my eyes as to whether it was true. He looked back at me without hesitation, pretty much letting me know that it was. "He's been trading his lunch for them. He's been trading other things for them too, toys and small things. He's allegedly traded over 20 students for their teeth across 3 grades. Today, the student in question had taken the trade but refused to give him any teeth. Your son responded by beating the teeth out of his mouth. I looked down at Brandon, asking what he was thinking. He didn't bother to answer, just clenched his fists in his lap and looked at the floor. I think that was when it really hit me how much he had changed. The bags under his eyes were dark and deep, and his fingers were long enough that I couldn't see how anyone didn't notice. Each finger seemed twice as long as it should be, and as he clenched, I could see a 4th knuckle on each of them. The reason we called you in, sir, is, well, to get those teeth back. I turned and looked at the principal. What do you mean? He looked a little green as he wiped his forehead with a napkin. We believe your son has the missing teeth, but he won't tell us where they are, and he won't give them back to us. We can't seem to find them, and the mother is hopeful that the dentist can put them back in if they're not too badly damaged. If anything else, they want them back so they can take them to the dentist and make sure they're baby teeth and not permanent. Brandon hasn't said a word about where he put them, and we are deeply troubled by this behavior. I looked at Brandon and asked him where the teeth were. He shook his head, not saying a word. I asked him again, and when he shook his head this time, I heard something. Something nearly indistinguishable, but altogether unsettling. Something was rattling in his mouth. We can sit here until you decide to give us the teeth, but you're not leaving until we get them back. I don't know what's gotten into you, I said, but the idea that we wouldn't be leaving seemed to decide him. He bent slowly over the principal's desk, making eye contact with the older man the whole time as he opened his mouth. 3 teeth fell out as he pushed his tongue out, and none of them appeared to be his. The teeth clattered on the desk like old dice, and more than one of them had a root hanging from them. As he sat back up, I had the sneaking suspicion that he was holding out. The principal, however, seemed more than okay with what he had gotten back. He told us to go, saying that Brandon was suspended for 2 weeks, and I collected up my son as we headed for the door. The principal managed not to vomit before we got out of his office, but it was a near thing. We talked the entire way home. Well, I talked. Brandon just sat there and said nothing. I told him I didn't know what this was about, but that he needed to stop. This wasn't him. This wasn't like him, and he needed to tell me what was going on so I could help. I was his dad. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't help him if he didn't talk to me. The whole time, he just sat there and stared at me. Most kids who are being chastised look out the window or look at their feet, but he stared directly at me in brazen defiance. His fingers kept flexing, and I saw him put a hand to his pocket more than once. I wanted to tell him to turn them out, to give me the tooth from that kid that he had kept, but something in me didn't quite dare. I was loath to admit it, but I was a little bit afraid of my son in that moment. He looked nothing like the boy that I had known for almost 7 years. My grandma used to tell me stories about babies taken by fairies and the changelings they left behind. This reminded me of those stories. The kid in front of me was so fundamentally different from the one I knew that it was almost like talking to a different person. As we pulled up in the yard, I told him he was grounded. No tablet, no TV, no dessert. But Brandon didn't seem to care. He just walked inside and went to his room. His tablet was still on the charger, and his TV remote was left hanging off the door to his room. I didn't know what he was doing in there, but it clearly wasn't playing. He was way too quiet, and when his mother called to tell me that she was working a double, I almost cried. I didn't want to be alone with him for longer than I had to be, and that made me feel even worse. He didn't come out for dinner, and when I went to bring him a plate a little while later, I heard muffled voices as he spoke to someone. I tried to get the teeth, but they caught me. I didn't know who he was talking to. Kinda thought he might be talking to himself, but when a gruff voice responded, I felt my stomach drop. "You'll just have to do better next time." The voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was deep and watery, like something from the bottom of a well, and it spoke in a way that made its mouth sound strangely full. It was devoid of any sort of kindness or charity, the sounds you sometimes hear when people speak to children. It was an authoritative voice, a teacher, and they were not pleased with my son. "I'm grounded. They suspended me from school. I'm not going to be able to get you any teeth for at least 2 weeks." "Your father has teeth," it said matter-of-factly. "Your mother has teeth too." When he answered, he didn't sound afraid. When he answered, it was with cold assuredness. "They won't just give them to me. They don't understand what I'm doing." What was he doing? That's what I wanted to know. I gripped the doorknob, hoping they wouldn't hear me, and that was when the voice said something that made my blood run cold. "Then do not ask them. Take them, like you did from the boy today." I opened the door in one fluid motion, and my son looked up guiltily as I walked into the room. "Who are you talking to?" I asked. "No one," he said, much too quickly. "I heard someone," I said. "I heard someone in here talking to you, and I want to know who it was and where they went." That was a lie. I didn't think I wanted to know who they were. What I wanted was for them to never come back. The person had sounded like some kind of demonic fairy from a kid's story, and I was afraid of what I would see if he did come back. "It's nothing," Brandon said quickly. Too quickly. I was doing voices." I talked to him for a little while longer, but I got nothing. He wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't tell me anything, and eventually, I just left. I should have left it at that. I should have just left it alone. But I had to try one more time. It was late, about 10:30, which is pretty late for us, and I decided to try a peace offering. I felt pretty certain he was still awake. I had heard something moving around in there, so I cut some of the pie I had made to go with dinner and walked to his room. I was going to offer him the pie and see if maybe we could talk. I just wanted to know what it was that had made him change so much. Most of all, I just wanted my son back. It killed me to have him act like this, but as the door came open, I got more answers than I had bargained for. It was standing over his bed, its arm going under his pillow, and in the darkness of his room, I realized it had to be what he'd been talking to. The pie fell to the ground, but I had a death grip on the plate. I realized later I had sprained my thumb once I was in any state to feel anything. I didn't speak. I could barely breathe, and as the thing turned to look at me, I realized my fairy theory might not be too far off. It was grubby looking, like something that's been living in a ditch. Its features were completely covered in something dark that had the texture of earth, except for the two large lamp-like eyes that protruded from its face like bubble lights. It was tall, something I realized as it took its full height. It had been crouched before, putting something under my son's pillow, and it had to stoop so as not to bang its head on the ceiling, which was about 9 feet from the floor. From its back, 4 insectile wings protruded. They weren't large enough to carry it, but they were large enough to be noticeable. Its hands and arms, the fingers multi-jointed, were far from delicate looking as it wiggled them ceaselessly. I expected it to charge me. I expected it to attack me, but instead, it raised one huge finger to its face and made a shushing sound. "Shh. You'll wake "The baby," it whispered, and its mouth sounded like it was trying to swallow something. Then it smiled, and I saw not a double, but a triple row of teeth inside its mouth. There's no order to them. Molars next to canines, next to bicuspids, next to what appear to be fangs and shark teeth. Its mouth is such a mishmash of teeth, it's impossible not to feel a little woozy when you look at it. It pulled its lips down, somehow containing all those teeth, and before my eyes, it vanished. My son was pretty upset when I grabbed him and carried him out of the house. I put him in the car and we waited till his mother got off work before taking him to a nearby motel. I told her what I'd seen as best I could, and I think she believed there might be something going on now. My son is furious, saying that he needs to get back home so he can do his job, but he won't say what that is. Honestly, I think he's been collecting teeth for whatever that thing was. When I went back inside to get some clothes and check the house, I looked under his pillow and found another one of those strange coins. There's a box under his bed, too, and inside it's equal parts teeth and coins. There are around 20 of them, and they're sitting next to teeth of every shape and every size. Most of them are animal teeth, but some of them are definitely human teeth. I've taken the entire box with me, but the phone call I got from my wife before I left the house was what really worried me. She called to tell me that our son had locked himself in the bathroom, and she was afraid he was hurting himself. There's a weird squelching noise, followed by him yelling and crying. He'd locked himself in the bathroom, but I went to the manager to unlock it for us. What we found in there will stick with me for a long time. We're at the hospital now. My wife is in the ER room with him, while I sit in the waiting room and wait for updates. Protocol states only one parent can go in at a time, and my son doesn't want me to go in there. He can't speak very well, but he made that very clear to my wife. I gave him space, not wanting to exacerbate his condition any more than I have to. I've got the box on my lap as I sit out here, and I'm not really sure what to do with it. Inside are the 8 teeth that he managed to pull out of his own head before we got him restrained. Whatever this creature is, it must get its due, and my son is apparently intent on giving it that due. We'll probably end up having to take him to a mental facility, but I know he isn't crazy. I saw that thing too, and I know it'll find him no matter where we take him. So be careful when you tell your kids about the tooth fairy. What comes to collect their teeth might be something far worse than even you can imagine. Driving a train sounds pretty exciting, right? It's really not. When you're taking your licensing course, you get a sense of excitement. You feel like you're part of a long legacy of train conductors. You imagine yourself dodging train robbers or having to solve a murder mystery, meeting guests for drinks in the dining car, or riding the trails to California or Texas. Well, in reality, you're mostly hauling cargo. Like many others, I found myself hauling freight cars through the dark at night. At this point in time, most things on the train come down to pushing buttons and trying not to hit people or things on the tracks. Run the horn every time you come within 100 feet of a crossing, make sure the tracks are in good shape, note any damage or signal malfunctions in your logbook, get to your destination and drop off your cargo. Rinse, repeat. I do the 6P to 6A run. Most of my route is done completely in the dark. The train rolls on while I sit at the controls, and Roger would take over every few hours so I can stand out on the platform and have a smoke or eat something out of the fridge we keep in the back. We don't haul passengers. Well, cattle sometimes, so there's no dining cars or sleeper cars or people besides Roger to talk to. After tonight, I guess I won't even have Roger. I'm pretty new at this, Roger having only worked here a few months longer than I had, and neither of us had any idea about track 54. All the tracks have mile markers, and between track mile 53 and 55 is, well, you guessed it, track 54. It runs through a deep stretch of woods, and the track is the only thing that's not trees or dirt for about 20 miles. It's a lonely stretch, and it gets a little creepy out there sometimes. Roger says it's bullshit, but I could swear you can see things in the woods watching the train as it goes by. The good thing about the woods is that they're only 10 miles from the depot we used to drop off cargo, so once you're there, you're almost half done with your shift. Tonight was a little different. I was sitting in the passenger seat, browsing Reddit on my phone, when I heard Roger swear and cut the brakes on sharply. I braced and looked out the glass, sucking in my breath when I realized why he had stopped. It's not uncommon to get stuff on the tracks, trees or animals sometimes, but this was definitely something we needed to call in. There was a body laying on the tracks. Roger keyed up the mic and called it in. "Engine 13 here on track 54.5, he said, looking at the screen, reporting a body on the tracks. The line went dead for a few seconds before someone came back from dispatch. "Engine 13, come back. Did you say a body on the tracks?" 10-4, human body on the tracks, said Roger. More static before someone came back over. A different someone than the young woman who had answered us. Is it living or is it dead?" Roger squinted at it for a moment. "Does it matter? There's a body on the tracks. It's the difference between calling the police and calling an ambulance, so yes, it matters." Roger sighed, glancing left and right at the woods before handing me the radio. "Keep these numbnuts updated while I go check what kind of body this is." Then he climbed out of the train and moved to the front of the cab. I could hear him calling the person on the tracks and getting no response. The body appeared to be sleeping there, arms and legs splayed out over the ballasts, but I couldn't tell if they were breathing or not from the cab. Roger didn't seem to want to leave the side of the train and investigate, probably wondering if this were a robbery of some kind. It's not as common as you'd think for people to block the tracks and rob a train. Our cargo is mostly cement powder or cinder blocks, maybe some quarried stone or various other things like AC units or unrefined oil. It's not really something a train robber would get away with easily. The handpiece crackled back to life as the older voice asked if we were still there. I told him we were, and that's when he asked for our location again. The way he asked made me feel a little anxious. He sounded relieved that I had answered, but sounded hesitant to have my location. "Track 54.5, I told him, eyes still on Roger as he walked closer to the body. Silence for a good 10 seconds followed. I watched Roger creep towards the man, almost comically. My eyes cut to the woods for a half second, thinking I had seen movement in the trees. Was it an optical illusion? The only light was the big headlight, and it made things in the peripherals look weird sometimes. Roger was nearing the tracks when the mic cut back on and made me jump. "Drive over it." I stared at the handpiece in surprise. "What?" "Drive over it. Get the hell out of there. No one's supposed to leave the cabin after track 50. Did no one tell you that?" I looked back up to Roger, who was poking the body with his foot, before turning back towards the train. "No, I've only been a driver for a few months. Roger and I..." But as I watched Roger coming back, I saw something long and white come galloping out of the woods and snatch him up. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It looked like a collection of white pipe cleaners formed into some kind of weird animal, and left in a backpack for a few days. It snapped up Roger in its mouth and was over the tracks and into the woods on the other side before I could get a good look at it. Roger was there 1 minute, and then gone the next. Engine 13, respond." "Something got Roger," I yelled into the mic. He went out to check the body and..." "Get that train in motion, now," yelled the man on the other end of the radio. I pushed the button, threw some levers, and the train started moving again. I heard the wheels tear through the body on the tracks, a wet and meaty sound, and soon I had it back up to 45 miles an hour again. I felt my breath coming out in hitching gasps as the forest careened around me, but the creature never made another appearance. I could still see that thing as it cantered across the tracks. I could still see Roger's face creased in terror as it grabbed him and took him off into the woods. I suddenly doubted they would ever find Roger, ever find the body I had chopped up beneath my wheels, and I knew there would be no sign of the creature at all. When I pulled into the depot an hour later, there were people waiting for me. People in suits from the Department of Transportation. They told me I had done the right thing. They told me I had been very brave and had saved my company millions of dollars in assets. They made me sign a lot of things, and told me to take some time off before coming back to work, if I still wanted to work, that was. They advised that I not talk to anyone about what had happened, and made me sign some papers saying that I wouldn't. Well, guess I screwed that up, didn't I? It's been a week, and I still see that thing when I close my eyes. I researched that stretch of track and the woods that surrounded it. There are more than a few strange stories about a creature that lives there. A hiker recently went missing, a man with dark hair and a thick beard who was wearing jeans and a blue t-shirt the last time anyone saw him. A man I would swear I saw laid across the tracks that night when Roger was taken. The line keeps calling to ask if I'm coming back to work. I just don't know if I can ever drive through those woods again. After someone sees this, I may not have to worry about that anymore.
Joe loved trains. He'd loved them since he was little, and it was a love affair that had lasted a lifetime. He had gotten his first train set when he was 5 years old, and though the models he had now were as different from that set as he was from the child he had been, he still remembered it fondly. His train set in the basement of the home he shared with his wife and daughter, and the table he had set up were so big that it took up nearly half the floor space. His wife often bemoaned how much room it ate up, but he ignored her for the most part. He paid the bills, he slaved away at work so his wife and daughter could live comfortably, and when he got home, all he really wanted to do was relax with his trains. He had a little cap he wore and a special pair of overalls, and he sat and listened to the trains chug along, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him anywhere else in life. He would sit down here for hours sometimes, just playing with his trains and letting life pass him by. He could hear his wife, Debbie, moving around upstairs, but he put her out of his mind too. Debbie would call down to let him know that dinner was ready, and then he'd have to leave his cap on the hook and go upstairs and spend time with his family. His family. Ugh, they were so dull. His wife would ask him about his day, a day that had been boring and monotonous and would be better forgotten in the basement with his trains. Jennifer would talk about cheerleading or some boy she liked, and Joe would pick at his food as he listened to nothing but the clickety-clack of train wheels in his mind. He was dreading hearing her come down the stairs, consoling himself by watching the trains go by. That's when he noticed the house for the first time. The house had been purchased at a hobby store 2 towns over. His wife had complained when he had told her where he was going to get the things he needed for his train set, but it really couldn't be helped. The hobby shop in town was not the sort that stocked train things. The greasy man behind the counter, the one wearing the Led Zeppelin t-shirt and a shiny ponytail, had pushed his glasses up his nose and informed Joe that unless he were here to play Warhammer, they did not stock models for that sort of hobby. So, Joe had gone 2 towns over to find a man who carried his sort of hobby. He had gotten about 5 little wooden houses for his diorama that day, but it was only now that he realized one of them looked a lot like his house. He hadn't painted them, they had come just as they were, but as he watched his trains chug around the place, he could see that one of them was a white house with a tan roof and a picket fence that went all the way around it. Joe didn't remember having seen it before, but as the train came around to pass it, he found his attention suddenly pulled to it. It was like a scene in a movie where the shot zoomed in on a certain object, and Joe felt his eyes drawn there inexorably. The house was sitting next to the tracks, and whoever might take in the breeze in the evening on the front porch would have a great view of the trains as they went by. In fact, he thought he saw someone leaning on the windowsill doing just that. There couldn't be anyone doing that. Joe hadn't put any people in any of the houses, but he saw someone nonetheless. He couldn't make the fellow out. He was like a giant trying to see a passing sparrow. But the longer he stared, the more familiar the man looked. As the train rolled past and kicked its water vapor smoke into the air, he imagined that he could see someone watching it wistfully. Joe put it out of his mind, swapping his CB steamliner for a larger diesel engine, and went back to enjoying the trains. Even so, as they continued to rumble around the track, he was drawn back to that house again and again. The man leaned on the sill and watched the locos as Joe swapped out trains. Was he a man? Joe felt certain that he was. He was still leaning there, watching the trains roll past with fascination, when Debbie called down to tell him that dinner was ready. Joe glanced at the stairs, momentarily drawn out of his daze, but when he looked back at the little man, he was gone. Maybe his wife had called him to dinner too, Joe thought with a snort as he put his hat on the hook and climbed the stairs. He'd have plenty of time after dinner to search for him again as he ran his trains on their endless courses through the landscape that he had created. And Martha said that her daughter got accepted into Ohio State. After all that bragging about getting into Dartmouth, her daughter couldn't get any higher than our own little state college. It just goes to show you what bragging gets you. Joe was plowing absent-mindedly through his mashed potatoes as Debbie prattled on about some friend of hers whose daughter was apparently too dumb to get into her college of choice. Ohio State was a fine college. Joe had gone to Ohio State to get his degree in engineering, but he didn't feel like saying as much. If he just agreed with her and let her get it out of her system, then she'd likely let him get back to his basement so he could play with his trains. He glanced over at his daughter, Jessica, and saw that she was attached to her phone as usual. She didn't have time for much else these days, and between TikTok and Instagram, she barely seemed to be in the world. She had no time for her parents, just her friends and her fans. Joe didn't really care. He was no better if he thought about it, and her attention to the phone meant that he had more time with his trains. And then she said she might make her daughter wait a year so she can take the entrance exam to Dartmouth again. Can you imagine having such a stagger between high school and college? You would... Can I be excused? Jessica asked suddenly. Diana wants to go live in a few minutes. Jessica, you've barely touched your vegetables, Debbie lamented, but Jessica was already getting up and leaving. Me too, said Joe, taking his plate to the sink, his vegetables noticeably gone. Debbie pursed her lips as the two of them made their hasty way to their various hobbies. Sure, why not? I only cooked the dinner, but I suppose I'll do the dishes, too. Neither of them were listening, though. Joe was heading downstairs, Jessica taking the stairs to the second floor 2 at a time, and Debbie was left sitting at the table. She wanted to cry. She wanted to rage at them, but she picked up her phone instead. She had a message there, a message that made her smile. And soon her absentee family was as far from her mind as Martha or her dummykin's daughter. The trains thundered over the plastic track, making their way through the little town that Joe had built for them. He could have as many as 5 trains going simultaneously on this setup, if he wanted to. As long as he kept his eyes on the switching times, they would never run afoul of each other. In the beginning, Joe had been afraid to run more than 2 at once, but now he was comfortable enough to run as many as he wanted. He could run 5 without even thinking about it, and that made him feel proud somehow. It was a silly thing to feel proud of, but he found that he did. And why shouldn't you feel proud? The rail line sure can't run itself, came a voice from the model below. Joe jumped a little, looking around to see who was talking. He looked at the steps, but there was no one there. He stood up, his chair making a harsh noise as he did, but as he looked across the basement, he couldn't find anyone there either. The voice hadn't been very loud, like a voice from outside, and he looked up to the little window near the top to see if someone was peeking in on him. "Down here, hoss," came a voice from the model, and he looked down to see someone sitting on the porch of the house that had looked a lot like his. He didn't remember putting a rocking chair on that porch, but as he watched, it went back and forth, and a tiny little man watched the trains roll by. Joe leaned down, coughing as one of the trains belched smoke as it went by, and as he looked, he saw the weathered face and overalls of an old man. He looked like a farmer, what his dad would have called a corn husker, and he had a little pipe in his mouth that was making its own smoke. Joe leaned down beside the house, and if the man was bothered by the presence of a giant man looming over him, he never showed it. "About time you noticed me. I've been waiting." Joe was speechless for a moment, trying to figure out a sense to the sudden arrival of this miniature man. Who are you?" he finally settled on. "Me? Why, I'm Bill Williams, remember?" Joe furrowed his brow. He didn't, but the name did sound familiar. The old man laughed. "Don't tell me you forgot your own town of Macklin. You built it, after all." Joe nodded. He had thought of the little town here as Macklin, named after the little town that he had grown up in, but he didn't think he had ever actually written anything down to christen it so. Come to think of it, the house here was where he had decided that Bill Williams would live. It was something he had been thinking about, as he planned to put down mailboxes outside the homes, and this was the house that he had planned to set the Williamsons' box outside of. Joe nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I had been planning to flesh the town out some. And not a moment too soon. We were feeling a little two-dimensional down here. Fred was just saying the other day." "Fred?" Joe asked. Bill cocked a finger at the house next door. "Yes, sir, Fred Murphy. He's only lived here since his folks passed a couple years ago, but we're real fond of him. He got his leg blown off in Korea, but he's got one of them new prosthetic legs, and he gets around just fine." As he said it, a little guy came out of the house next door and wished his wife a fond farewell. He had a pretty noticeable limp, but Bill was right. It didn't slow him down in the least bit as he went down the steps and climbed into a little blue Datsun Matchbox car that Joe had glued into place there. To Joe's further surprise, he started the car up and drove off down the road. "It sure was swell of his old man to leave him the hardware store down on 5th Street. Fred does a swell job of running it now, and we all thank him for it." The blue Datsun took its time as it went from the little red house beside Bill's to the hardware store about 3 streets over. Joe had made it from a kit that he'd picked up at Walmart around Christmas time, but as Fred climbed out and stumped towards the festive cardboard building, Joe thought it looked far more three-dimensional than he remembered. He'd been so busy focusing on Fred and his shiny blue car that he jumped a little as the post truck drove by, and a hand came out of the window to put mail in the box. "Right on time. Letter carrier Loretta is always so punctual. We were sure sad to see Charlie retire, but Loretta has been a great mail lady in his absence. Her daughter just got into Ohio State. Did you know that? We're all so proud of her. It's quite a school." Joe was practically kneeling beside the table as it all came to light before his very eyes. His trains weren't the only thing moving suddenly, and he saw people going to the shops and driving their cars over the streets. A little bell rang as a group of kids left the schoolhouse, heading for home. Some people went into the department store he had built on Main Street, while a few others went to the bank. There were homes to go back to, dinners to eat, TVs to watch, and Joe seemed to be master over all of it as he watched it all stretch out before him. Bill knew them all, every story, every home, and he regaled Joe with countless tales of their lives. Joe, for his part, was enthralled. He sat listening to Bill as the sun began to set outside the little window above his head, and when it became too dark to see, he reached up to pull the light cord, almost absent-mindedly. The Christmas lights he had strung above the model twinkled like stars, and Joe saw headlights wink on as people made their way home or out for other activities. When his wife called to tell him that she was going to bed and asked if he meant to stay down there with his trains all night, Joe realized it was nearly 10 o'clock. He had spent all afternoon down here talking to Bill about the little town he had made out of cardboard and model kits, and now he needed to get some shut-eye. Needed to, but didn't really want to. "Land sakes," Bill said, checking his watch. "I gotta get to bed. Sorry, hoss, but we'll have to continue this some other time. Tomorrow, maybe," he said, and Joe thought he looked almost as hopeful as Joe was. Of course, Joe said hurriedly. I'll come down right after work. Sounds like a plan to me. See you tomorrow, Joe, Bill said. He went into his house, and Joe reached up to turn the lights off before deciding to leave them on. Let the little people enjoy the stars tonight. Joe couldn't honestly remember a better week in his life. It had been hard to sleep that first night, his mind all a tizzy with the concept of a whole city in his basement. But he had finally managed to drop off. He had blown through his work the next day, finding joy in tasks that had been nothing but mundane until then, and he had finished early that day. He'd come home while his wife was out buying groceries and went straight to the basement to talk to Bill. The little man knew everyone in town, and Joe was so engrossed in his stories that his wife had come halfway down the stairs before he even heard her. "You're home early," she said almost hopefully. "Yeah, I got done with my stuff early, so they said I could go," Joe said. They stood staring at each other as the smile slipped off her face. She had clearly been hoping that he had come home early to surprise her, but it was becoming apparent that he had come home early to play with his trains. Joe couldn't understand her sudden interest or the increasing slip back towards this interest. She had expected something, maybe? Had he forgotten something, like a birthday or an anniversary? He was bad at remembering those. Joe often found it hard to relate to people. He sometimes wondered why Debbie had agreed to marry him at all, but he believed that she had once found these things endearing in him. Joe wasn't sure what had changed, but it wasn't him. "Well, I'll just leave you to it. Dinner should be ready in a little while. I'll call you." She went back upstairs, the door closing a little harder than it strictly needed to when she got to the top. Wonder what that's about?" Bill asked. Joe had only shrugged, and the rest of the week had gone by much the same. If Debbie seemed more distant than usual, Joe hadn't noticed. If she spent more time on her phone, what of it? Jessica spent most of her time on the phone. Maybe Debbie had found something to do on her phone, too. He spent most of his time in the basement talking to Bill as he learned about the fascinating history of the town and its people. The longer they talked, the more real the town seemed. The buildings took on definition. The cardboard surfaces became three-dimensional. The pictures on the outside seemed to grow, the barrels and bicycles and signs they bore, and the whole town came to life before his eyes. Before Joe knew it, it was Sunday, and he was sitting in the basement with Bill having a beer. "Joe, we're friends, aren't we?" Bill asked suddenly. Joe nodded, not having to give much thought to it. "Yeah, Bill, I'd say we are. And friends tell people things they suspect might change their lives, don't they?" Joe nodded a little slower, not sure where this was going. "Well, Joe, they say a man's home is his castle, and I believe your wife is trying to invite a dirty rascal into your castle." Joe's eyebrows knit together. "What you mean, Bill?" "I mean, your wife was down here doing laundry a couple of days ago, and she was talking to somebody on the phone. Conversation was getting, shall we say, a little spicy. And I thought to myself, good for Joe. He deserves a little something extra. But when she called the fella by name, the name wasn't Joe. This guy's name was Simon, and it seems your old lady is really taken with him." Joe wasn't sure how to process this. Why would Debbie cheat on him in the first place? He paid the bills, maintained the insurance, kept the cars up, fixed the house when it needed it, and paid a handyman when he couldn't fix it. He did all the things that were expected of him, and if she felt uncared for, why hadn't she said something? "Bill," Joe said, not really sure what to say. "Are you sure?" "I think I am, Joe. Think you may need to get your house in order. Now, I say this as your friend, Joe, but it ain't right for a woman to run around on a man like that. She needs to be corrected, Joseph. She needs to be reminded who's in charge around here." Joe shuddered as he took a sip of his beer. No one had called him Joseph in a long time. The only person who called him Joseph was his father, and he was dead and in the ground. The name felt like footsteps on his grave, and he wasn't sure he liked it. Joe perked up his ears as he heard footsteps overhead, the clank of plates as they were set out, drawing him back to reality. Sounds like dinner's ready. I should go, Bill. Debbie will be expecting me. Sure, Bill said. Man needs his victuals. Come back when you can, Joe. I'm not going anywhere. Joe went slowly up the stairs, watching the model get smaller and smaller as he climbed. He wasn't sure he would be back after dinner. Joe might have lost his taste for trains. Just a little bit. Joe grimaced as he ate the hamburger helper. Joe hated hamburger helper. The noodles were always mushy, the cheese always tasted funny, and there was just something unnatural about the concoction. It really wasn't a fit meal for Sunday dinner anyway. Debbie usually made ham or burgers or something with some substance. He would be hungry again in no time after a meal like this. Jessica was picking at her food, but Debbie's was still untouched. She was glued to her phone, texting someone, and by the look on her face, she was enjoying the conversation. There was a look there that Joe had never seen before, not even when they were dating, but it was a look he knew. It was that sultry look that women sometimes got when they were talking to someone they liked, maybe even liked a lot. I might go see some friends after dinner, Debbie said, taking up her plate and dumping the cooling lump back into the pan. You guys may have to fend for yourself for bedtime. Jessica shrugged. Sounds good. Have fun, Mom. She didn't even bother to look at Joe. Debbie just went upstairs to get ready, leaving him to take care of cleanup. He was still scrubbing when she left, and when he asked when she would be back, Debbie just said not to wait up. Joe couldn't help but notice she was wearing her favorite dress, the black one without sleeves, and that this was usually a date night outfit. It had been a while since they'd had a date night, not since her birthday a few months ago, but Joe recognized the dress. He finished the scrubbing and grabbed another beer, heading for the basement again. He needed to talk to someone, and Jessica certainly wasn't going to be any help in this situation. The following week was so different from the one before it that Joe almost felt like he had whiplash. Debbie went out almost every night, and when she was in, she was glued to her phone. She took her phone calls outside or upstairs in her room these days, and he had noticed some new clothes hanging on the closet door. You would have said this would be great, Joe left to his own devices to pursue his interests, but something had changed after Bill had told him about his suspicions. He didn't suddenly find himself afraid of losing Debbie. This wasn't a Hallmark movie, but he did worry about how this would change his routine. Suddenly, the prospects of not having as much disposable income, of having dinner late, or his responsibility, or having to worry about clean clothes and dishes in the sink, was a real problem. Then, of course, there was the little voice whispering in his ear as he sat in the basement, contemplating his situation. She's making a fool out of you, Joseph, strutting around with someone else, probably already in his bed and violating her wedding vows. She's putting cuckold's horns on you, and that ain't right. Joe drank his nightly beer, the bottles becoming plural as the week went on, and thought about what Bill was saying. It's impossible, Joe said at first. Why would she do such a thing? I'm a great provider. She'd have no reason to go looking for someone else. Bill had snorted. Who knows, Joseph? Sometimes women are just unreasonable. They feel like what they have isn't good enough, so they go looking for something on the side. Who can say what's going through her head? Joe didn't want to believe it, but he was slowly beginning to come around. As he and Bill sat and listened to the trains run and the town thrive, Joe wished he could go live in Macklin himself. Life in Macklin looked simple, and Joe could use something simple right now. His life had become very complicated as of late, and he wanted to return to something more wholesome, a place where wives and daughters honored their father for his sacrifice, and dinner was on the table when he got home, a place where people were satisfied with their lot. By Thursday, Joe was certain that his comfortable life was coming unraveled. He came down in the same clothes he'd gone to work in, not feeling like dressing in his conductor's overalls much these days, and found Bill sitting with Fred on the porch as the two smoked their cigarettes. They had been talking quietly as he came down, but they looked up and waved as he noticed them. "Got some bad news, Joe," Bill said, taking a long drag off his cigarette before letting the smoke out like some kind of a wrinkled dragon. "Your old lady had a friend over to the house today." This was news to Joe, since Debbie hadn't been here when he'd come home. He'd found the breakfast dishes in the sink, the clothes still on the line, and his wife gone off somewhere. Joe told himself that she was getting things for dinner, but who knows? Was she out with friends, or just one friend? He didn't know that either, but he was beginning to suspect it was just the one friend now. "How can you be sure?" Joe asked, not wanting to believe it. "Shoot, Joseph, you could hear him carrying on up there. I'd imagine there's a few loose springs in your bed these days. Then they left again, and then you came home about an hour later." Joe sat down heavily, trying to make sense of all of it. This can't be happening. I refuse to believe this is happening," Joe said, putting his face in his hands as he rested his head on the table. "Afraid it is, hoss," Bill said, taking another long drag off his cigarette. "I'm just glad my Millie never strayed like this. Think we both know what would have to happen if she did, don't we?" he said, he and Frank nodding in unison. Joe opened his fingers as he turned his head. What would have to happen? "Well, let's just say there'd be a fresh plot in the backyard if my old lady tried to step out on me like that." Joe was silent for a few seconds, seeming to weigh Bill's words as he thought about what he was saying. I could never do anything like that." Bill gave him a hard look, no mean feat for someone with eyes that small, before shrugging. "Nah, I guess not. I guess we're just cut from different cloth, hoss." Joe went back upstairs, the basement suddenly not seeming so inviting. The house above was quiet. Jessica hadn't come home, spending the night with a friend, and Debbie was still out. Joe went to the kitchen to see if there was anything to eat, but most of it looked less than appetizing. In the end, he just sat there as night fell outside, his stomach grumbling and his anger rising. Who was Debbie out there with? Had she actually brought them to the house? He wondered briefly if what Bill was telling him was real, if the little people of his train town were real, but the thought wouldn't hold. Of course they were real. They spoke to him, and he had seen them with his own eyes. Joe wasn't imaginative enough to create something like that from whole cloth. Joe liked trains, he liked to build, but he wasn't delusional. The idea that this might be some kind of psychotic break never even occurred to him. In his mind, everything was ordered, and Joe had everything in its proper place. The headlights of Debbie's car slid across him as she pulled into the driveway. He heard her come up the walk, heard her keys slide into the lock, and as she came in, he watched her take her shoes off before coming inside. She was creeping in like a kid out past curfew, and when she saw him lurking in the dark living room, she jumped and screamed, dropping her shoes. "Jesus, Joe," she said, putting her hand to her chest, you scared me to death." Joe didn't say anything, just watched her as she bent down to collect her shoes. "Were you expecting dinner? Sorry, I went out with some of the girls. I figured you could manage for yourself for a night." She was smiling. All smiles was his Debbie, but when he didn't say anything or get up to follow her, she sighed and rolled her eyes. "Are you mad or something? It was just one meal. It's not like you pay me any attention when I'm here anyway. Figured you'd be thrilled to have the house to yourself. Just you and your trains." She stood looking at him for a count of 12, but Joe really couldn't think of anything to say. "Fine, be that way," she said dismissively. "I'm going to bed. Good night." As she went up, Joe began to feel a little guilty about thinking she might be stepping out on him. He'd been paranoid. Surely it was nothing. She had a good life here, but it seemed it was getting a little mundane for her. She just wanted to go out more and do some fun things. Joe was a bit of a homebody. Maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the world if he had to cook a meal for himself now and then. As the Starrlight came on, though, Joe saw something that made him rethink. He had been on the verge of rising, meaning to apologize for being weird, when he saw a purple mark on her neck. It wasn't huge, wasn't ghastly, but it was big enough to be noticed by Joe from his seat on the couch. She had made no effort to hide it, may not have even been aware it was there, but as she headed upstairs, Joe headed down to the basement instead. He owed Bill an apology, it seemed. The weekend went by without much trouble. Joe spent most of it home by himself since Jessica went to stay with a friend and Debbie went on a girls' weekend with her friends. Friends, Joe thought as she kissed his cheek and walked out the door with her suitcase. Right. He believed that, as much as he believed that the hickey she had covered with makeup was a rash. By the time the two of them came back Sunday night, Joe was ready for Monday. He'd practiced a few times, a few of those times ending painfully, and as he slid back in through the basement window, he made no sound. He had eaten his breakfast that morning, kissed his wife goodbye, and left for work, just as he had 100 times before. Then he pulled into the parking lot of the Dunkin' Donuts about 3 blocks away and called his boss to tell him he wasn't feeling well and that he'd be taking the day off. His boss had understood, had told him he hoped he felt better, and Joe had slid his slacks off to reveal jogging pants underneath. His polo came off too, revealing a tight jogging shirt, and he added a hat and some sunglasses before leaving the car and jogging up the road. When he came to his house 30 minutes later, there was already a car in the driveway. It appeared she hadn't wasted any time. As he came slowly around the side of the house, he could see the two of them embracing in the living room. Debbie with her hands all over a dark-haired man, a little younger than Joe. Joe could have probably come right in through the front door without them noticing, and they worked their way upstairs as he made his way to the basement window. He couldn't believe she was doing something like this in the living room, with the curtains open nonetheless. Anyone could see her. He was in through the window in a matter of seconds, and no one in the house was the wiser. As he came to the head of the stairs, he reached down beside the banister and felt for what he had hidden there. Joe wasn't a violent man, but he understood the need for home defense. His father had owned this particular shotgun since Joe was a kid. When he died, Joe had taken it to his house. Debbie hadn't liked it, saying that Jessica might hurt herself with it, so Joe had always kept it in the basement. He had thought it was stupid then, but now he was glad that she hadn't let him put it in the bedroom closet like he'd wanted. It would have been harder to lay hands on there. "Good luck," Bill said from the model, and Joe nodded to him as he made his way quietly up the stairs. He could hear them as he came into the kitchen, but the basement door had been oiled, so it wouldn't give him away. They would never know how many times he had practiced this, how many times he had crept from the basement to the bedroom. This would definitely qualify as premeditated if he was caught, and any investigator worth his salt would be able to tell. Joe didn't care, though. Bill had already let him know that this was something a husband did when he loved his wife and needed to let her know her place. That place, Joe knew, would be in the backyard by the oak tree. There were clothes scattered around the living room, but nothing too intimate. A sock here, a pair of stockings here, a shirt thrown across the couch, a shoe by the door, and all in line towards the stairs. They'd been busy already, and Joe wondered what she would have done if he had forgotten something and had to come back. Joe realized that she knew him too well, though. He never forgot anything. Joe was meticulous, driven by his routine, and he would have no more forgotten something he needed then he would have left without his pants. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, listening to them as they did their cheating on the floor above. It was shameful. She'd never made noises like that for him, even when he had been interested in things like that. She had mostly just lain there, dutifully, but it sounded like she was being more than dutiful for him. He stopped again at the midpoint as the stair creaked a little, but they were making too much noise by then. They didn't even hear as he slid the door open, but when he cocked the shotgun and pointed it at the pair of them, Debbie screamed in something other than passion. The gun blammed before either of them could make their case, and Joe was left standing there in the aftermath. Joe came running into the basement, slamming the door behind him and throwing the lock. He could see the flashing lights from the basement window, and he knew that they'd be coming down the stairs any time now. His plan hadn't been quite as well planned as he had thought, and now it was all coming apart. He had stood there in the bedroom, looking over what he had done for several minutes before he heard sirens coming from up the street some. There was no way they had already been called about the gunshot. Less chance that they were close already. Someone had to have seen him go into the house. Someone who had then heard the shots while they were still on the phone with the emergency services. Now they had his number, and he was out of escape routes. Joe went to the model, looking down at Bill's house as he tried to find the old man. For one terrible second, he was worried that he wouldn't be there, that it would have all been a trick or a delusion, and that he had done all this for nothing. No cars moved on the street, no people walked between the buildings, and as the voice came from the floor above, Joe started to shake. "Bill! Bill, I need your help! The cops are after me, Bill!" No answer. Joe heard something heavy hit the front door, rattling the frame. "Bill! Bill!" Bill said nothing. The loud bang came again. "Bill!" Joe yelled, hearing something break upstairs as whatever they were hitting the door with broke the frame. "What's all the ruckus, hoss?" Joe looked down, seeing Bill as he stuck his head out of the window of the second story. His hair was standing in corkscrews, and he was rubbing his eyes sleepily. Bill looked as if Joe had awoken him from some deep sleep, and Joe wondered how anyone could sleep through something like that. Joe's heart was hammering like the cops on his door, and his blood pressure felt ready to send his heart out of his chest. "Bill, thank God! Listen, the cops are at the door. They're going to arrest me." "Oh," Bill said, leaning out the sill. "Well, that is a problem." The two were quiet for a moment, staring at each other, and Joe winced as he heard the door cave in under their blows and boots as they came into the foyer. "What do I do?" Joe asked. Bill said, the police upstairs telling Joe to come out with his hands up. "I suppose you could turn yourself in, let 'em know you caught your wife cheating, and just kind of snapped." Joe heard someone test the lock on the basement door before calling for help. "Aw," Bill said, "you could always come live here." Joe looked surprised. You mean in Macklin?" "Sure. You know, we've been looking for a conductor for the railroad. You could live at the railway house, drive the trains, and never worry about anything ever again." Someone drove a boot into the basement door, and the lock shuddered. "How?" Joe asked. Bill extended a hand. "Come with me, Joe. Come away from all that and live with decent folks." Bill's whole hand wouldn't fit on the end of Joe's finger, but as he reached carefully towards him, the tingle that ran through him was worse than the most painful Charlie horse he had ever had. When he opened his eyes, however, he was face to face with the smiling old man. "Joe," Bill said, casting a hand out to the city, "welcome to Macklin." Jessica opened the basement door and looked down into the darkness. It had been 5 years since her mother's death and her father's disappearance, and Jessica hadn't been back since the day her grandparents had driven away from her childhood home. She was 22 now, about to leave for college, and was hoping to maybe get a little help with tuition after she sold the house. Everything else that her parents had owned had been sold and the money placed in trust for her, but she wasn't allowed to touch it until she was 25. Great. Thanks, Mom and Dad. That was really going to help her pay for college. Selling the house would more than get her what she needed, but Jessica hated coming back here. The house had remained untouched for the last 5 years. The locals thought it was haunted. Most of them also thought her dad was secretly living in it, and he had taken refuge in the walls after killing her mom. But if he had, then no one had ever found him. Everyone believed he had killed her mother, shot her and her lover in the bed that they had shared, and then made a clean escape. Jessica had mixed feelings about the situation, feelings that made grieving difficult when the wound was fresh. On the one hand, her mom had been cheating on her father, and that was bad. On the other, her father was such a cold and obtuse person that it was a wonder her mother hadn't cheated on him before that. She had known her father for her entire life and knew little about him, beside the fact that he liked trains. She couldn't remember a time when he had ever shown interest in something that she had liked, or even a time when he had just asked her about her day. It was sad when the most interesting thing about your father was that he might have killed your mother. The basement looked exactly the way she remembered it. The washer and the dryer still stacked with clean, unfolded clothes. The shelves still held a random assortment of things, and the train set still took up most of the floor space. Jessica grimaced. She would have to do something about it if she was going to sell the house. Some of those trains could even be worth money, she reflected. As if hearing her thoughts, something made an angry scutter across the tracks of the little town, and Jessica squeaked before retreating back up the stairs. Nuts to this, she would investigate the basement another day, maybe when Randy was free to help her. The basement had always been creepy to her, and that hadn't changed with time in the slightest. She slammed the door and went to look at the rest of the house, leaving the basement to its own devices. Joe felt the breeze as the diesel loco thundered down the tracks. He pulled the cord and listened to the whistle blow as he waved to the passers-by who had stopped to wait for the train. He couldn't remember anything before he had taken up the cap and overalls that made him the conductor of the Macklin line, but he was sure it hadn't been better than this. No wife, no kids, nothing but train times and passenger schedules. Sometimes when he wasn't driving the train, he sort of remembered someone from before he had come here. A woman and a girl, a house, a boring job, a boring life, but none of that really mattered. Joe was happy, happier than he had ever been, and as he drove past Bill's house, he waved to his old friend as he sat whistling on the porch. They would have some beers later, Millie cooking them another wonderful dinner, and then Joe would wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. Yes, sir, Macklin was the best little town in the whole damn world.